Joining us now is Pierre Debbas, managing partner at Romer Debbas. Pierre, great to have you with me today. What are the contingencies that buyers should be aware of in light of this pandemic?
Well, thank you for having me today as well. So it's a very timely topic because we are in an extraordinarily challenging time, to say the least. And the real estate market has been relatively active for what we're going through. However, you really have to be able to navigate all the issues in order to properly, facilitate transaction now. And to your point, the word contingency is being thrown around left and right because really the essence of a contingency is trying to hedge against the unknown and taking into consideration all the factors that's going on in the market and predicting what risk can ensue during the course of the transaction. Now, what are we talking about from a contingency perspective? We're worried about another shutdown. If there's a second wave of the virus come the fall that causes a government shutdown, causes buildings not to permit move-ins or move-outs, which we encountered, keep in mind, throughout March, April, and May. And that threw a wrench into a lot of our transactions, and any contractor in the country did not previously contemplate something of that nature. So that's a very common one. You can kind of refer to it as a force majeure contingency in a sense. Secondly, financing. We want to ensure that buyers who require financing in order to secure a transaction are still going to be able to obtain the mortgage that they were hopeful today versus maybe 90 days from now. Typical transactions, especially in New York City, where I practice is 60 to 90 days. A lot of things as we've seen so far in 2020 can change over the course of 60 to 90 days. So, general financing contingency. Two other important ones. Employment contingency. Depending what profession you're in, unemployment is at a historic high now. And a huge variable to that is that what percentage of those jobs are furloughed and what percentage of those jobs will never come back. And if we do encounter a second wave of this, depending on what profession you're in, you're going to be very concerned with your job stability. And if you're going to, consummate a real estate transaction in a circumstance like this, it's very reasonable to want in what's called an employment contingency that you'll still, the transaction is contingent upon you still being gainfully employed at the time of closing. And how do we define it? We define it essentially by having the buyer, who would be the party that would exercise the contingency, provide a letter from their employer that they've been terminated, and not for performance purposes, solely due to the economic issues and concerns, economic impacts by COVID. So we get the employment letter, we contact somebody, the HR at the company, and if that's the case, there could be a penalty that's maybe implemented as well if the buyer has to enforce that.
Yeah, I'm curious about different kinds of housing markets. How does negotiating change for contingency, say, when you're in a seller's market, for example?
It's funny. I always like to joke that our negotiations, like I'm a real estate lawyer, and we negotiate hundreds of transactions on an annual basis. And no matter how brilliant our arguments are, all of our arguments are driven by market conditions. So in a seller's market, I can have every brilliant argument under the sun for why I need to protect the buyer. However, my leverage is limited if it is in fact the seller's market. And what we're seeing now, especially in New York City, we're seeing the market all over the place. We're seeing, on the high-end market, significant discounts, and we're seeing in the market of the $1 to $3 million range, we had four clients last 2 weeks that entered into bidding wars on their transactions. Who would have ever, anticipated a bidding war in the middle of a pandemic? So it really, it's case by case and market to market what I'm discussing. However, these are all important factors that any real estate professional should be taking into consideration.
Is there any way to retroactively protect these buyers if they run into issues in light of the pandemic?
That's a tough one. So yes, the short answer is yes, not contractually. So, again, like I stated earlier, the contract if you drafted and negotiated a contract pre-pandemic, you were not able to forecast for anything that we're going through right now. So at the end of the day, if an issue does arise during the pendency of a deal, we are the phrase that everybody's tired of hearing in unprecedented times. And, right now, our job is counsel to a buyer or seller is to navigate through these times, which we've learned, we developed a lot of skill sets in 2008, 2009, when, that crisis, in my opinion, was far worse than this. And it's not necessarily just what's in the contract, It's your ability to navigate through this and to negotiate appropriately for your clients.
You alluded to this, but how does a force majeure work differently than a contingency?
So force majeure is a fancy phrase for act of God. And a force majeure really is applicable when, an act of God resulted in damage to a property which prohibits access and use of that property. So there's a lot of cases right now pending in court, whether the pandemic such as this, it falls under the category of force majeure. What we're negotiating in a sense is that if there are shutdowns again, if there is an inability to access property, that would, for our purpose, fall under the force majeure concept. However, by case law, the city of New York or whatever state you may be transacting in, if they shut down that area, the building physically can be accessed. It's maybe the board of the building that is prohibiting access. If it's a single-family home, you're not prohibited from moving in, moving out. So it really is just kind of taking that concept and adapting it to state market.
Pierre, thank you so much for your time and for those pointers. That's Pierre Debbas, managing partner at Romer Debbas. Thanks again. Coming